So I think though that if you were going to focus on one thing, I would say forget about the where and when, if you can. If it's not germane to the job, let your employees figure that out along with the how. Your job is to tell them the what and the why. So if you can focus on the deliverables and what needs to get done and how and the quality of that work, and then that, and you allow your employee to figure out the why, you're going to get to the right place. And you'll have a much better way of measuring the outcomes.
Hi, I'm Rob Sadow, and you're listening to the Flex Perspectives podcast, where we interview the world's best thinkers, researchers, and operators on how to make flexible work work. Flex Perspectives is brought to you by Flex Index, the world's most robust source for full-time, hybrid, and remote work requirements. Flex Index represents more than 8,000 companies, 60,000 office locations, and 100 million people. Today, my guest is Adrienne Rowe. Adrienne is the head of workplace strategy for RTX, the Fortune 500 defense contractor that does almost $70 billion in annual revenue. In this episode, we dive into how Adrienne started Disney shaped her perspective on employee experience, what questions execs should be focused on instead of where people work, and how flexibility can be applied to place-based roles. If you enjoyed this podcast, please help us out. Subscribe and give us a rating. It helps us understand what episodes our listeners find most valuable and helps new listeners find the podcast. Adrienne, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So I have to ask one question that is totally separate from your work at Raytheon and Merck to start. I believe you're a Gator fan. Is that correct?
I am a Gator. I'm not sure I'm a fan. But yes, I went to University of Florida for my business degree.
Okay.
Way back when.
Got it. I'm from Atlanta originally. I'm a huge Georgia fan. And so you being a Gator, but less of a fan, I think sits better for me than if you were a diehard in some fashion.
I don't think there's any conflict there at all.
So you have a fascinating career, I think, in the different places that you've been, really storied in blue chip companies, but also in very different roles that I think have shaped your mindset and perspective quite a bit from our conversations. I want to kind of rewind the clock back to the start. I think you started your career at Disney World. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And tell me a little bit about why Disney and what you were doing at Disney in those early days.
So I was an English major in the early 90s, and there was not a lot of opportunity upon graduation. But during school, I did the Disney College program and really just loved the environment. I loved the brand. And so my summer after my freshman year, I went back and did a second internship in human resources. And that became kind of my launching pad to come back after graduation and start a career. So I didn't really know exactly what I wanted to do, but I knew that was a great place to do things.
And where did you start in Disney? Like, what was your initial role, or what did you focus on?
I started in HR, particularly in what Disney calls casting, which is really recruiting and interviewing. So I would interview, 10, 12 people a day for hourly roles in the parks.
Got it. And was it more that Disney was interesting as a company, or that you found that particular role to be interesting relative to what you had studied or what you were interested in? Like, how did you make that decision? That
role actually found me. So when the recruiters came back after my first college program, which was actually in Magic Kingdom custodial, so very different, I spoke at the recruiting session and talked a lot about how I learned things that I had never anticipated learning. I kind of went there thinking, okay, this is the best I can get. But I learned a lot about people who do that type of work day in and day out, week in and week out, support their families, go to doctor's appointments. And I think she took a shine to that and said, you might be good in human resources. So that was the beginning.
It's funny. So it's almost like a calling in some way that maybe you didn't even recognize at first, as much as somebody else around you was like, hey, maybe this would be something that'd be interesting for you to spend time on.
I think so. I think I'm a constant student, and it was a great opportunity to learn about the business and the people side of the business. So, that was my launch.
And to go deeper on what you were just describing, from recruiting, I think you started to move in toward more kind of like workforce planning. And can you tell a little bit more about what is workforce planning and what did that look like for you at Disney as you kind of moved into that?
Yeah, so I think it's impossible to suppress your inner nerd for very long. And so mine came out. I had never done math in my undergraduate degree, but after I went to business school for an MBA, I realized that it wasn't beyond me. I just needed to practice and take time to learn the basics. And it turned out I was actually pretty good at it. So, and I wanted to do more. So after recruiting, I became a generalist, and then I was sort of pulled in to do a workforce planning role for the cruise line as that was opening up. And it just went from there.
And workforce planning entails what exactly for folks that maybe are less familiar in practice?
Well, this was a very specific environment that Disney was launching its second ship. And the big challenge every week was, how do we get 909 people exactly on the ship as crew? You can't have more than that because you only have 909 berths, but any fewer than that, and the experience starts to suffer. So it became and those roles are all on contracts, so, and they're different lengths of time. So it was an exercise in figuring out, how do you make contract terminations more predictable, and how do you structure the onboarding process so that you have the right number of people at the right time.
And you had to find 909 every week. Did I hear that correctly? Is that every week?
Sailing. Mm-hmm.
Stressful in terms of the approach and making sure that you got it right?
I at the time had a great mentor who I'm actually going to see next week in Florida. And she really helped me think about it in terms of an overall process and looking at root causes. And it wasn't just about getting people on the ship. It was about, why are they getting off the ship before their planned time? So it was just really interesting work. But, like any new business, that's always stressful, but it's a good stress. It's very energizing.
And how did that pave the way for other things you did at Disney? And then we'll talk a little bit then about kind of like where you went on from Disney, but curious what else you did while you were in that chapter.
My next role was in marketing research. And because I wanted to do more analytics, and that was like boot camp for me. I learned SPSS, I learned statistics, I learned how to do market sizing, I learned how to do visitation studies and business drivers measurement. And I had a boss at that time who was just an incredible stickler for detail and making sure your numbers tie. And so that was my boot camp. I really learned how to do good work product. Disney's the kind of place where if you do your job well and you have an interest in something, you'll get pulled in different directions. And if you turn to a different direction, you can push yourself a little bit and find other things to do. So that was really why I stayed there so long. I was able to have many different careers in one place. So marketing research was the next. And then I went on to a project in a group called Work-Life Initiatives. And that was really where I started to make the bridge to what I'm doing now. So that project was building 2 childcare centers on property that are open 365 days a year, 17 hours a day. They accommodated, I think, 600 plus kids at a time. Very innovative concepts. And that was a real learning for me as well, going through the whole construction process and design and making those trade-offs, because childcare is a tough business in terms of margins. So making the numbers work was not easy. And but at the end of it, we delivered an amazing offering for our employees that I'm still very proud of.
What about that experience? You said that it started to shape or form some of the work you would do over the rest of your career. What about it in particular? Was it the type of work or a certain energy that you felt for it? Like how did that start to lay a foundation for you?
I would say a couple of things. The work involves dimensions that are really appealing to me. So the design aspect, the analytic aspect, and being able to build something and touch it when you're done and say, this is what we made, is pretty amazing. The other piece, though, what really got me or keeps me in this line of work is I saw how impactful an employer can be and how much supporting employees and addressing their needs can enhance, obviously, their lives, but also make them better employees. They deliver better work product and they have less stress. And so that became, sort of a calling that I grabbed onto.
And that was probably pretty groundbreaking at that time, right? Thinking about kind of like the whole employee and both outside of work and inside of work, which I think if some companies had started to adopt, but I don't think it was a widespread perspective yet necessarily in blue chip companies in terms of how do we think about investing against that.
Probably not, but Disney kind of was already halfway down that path because of the focus on the guest. So it's not a big leap to go from you take care of your employee, they'll take care of the guest. And so that was, as long as I was there, always a part of the equation at Disney. So it wasn't, we didn't have to really sell a lot of people on that idea.
That makes sense. And so you were at Disney for a long time, as you talked about, and in some pretty interesting places, right? Florida, I think you're in Hawaii for a period. Mm-hmm. You made the change, I believe, to, was it Fidelity next, I think, in That's Boston? Right. That must have been a big shift. Like, how did you think through that and what made that appealing?
I had done the project in Hawaii, and I was essentially a PMO or sort of a chief of staff for the VP, who actually I just saw last month, who was in charge of that that resort launch. And Hawaii it was an incredible project. Aulani, if you've never been there, get there. Just a tremendous amount of attention to detail and Native Hawaiian culture, and really doing the work to make sure that we got it right and consulting with the right people. Joe Rohde was the lead Imagineer, and he just is phenomenal. So between the project itself and the landscape of Hawaii, which is gorgeous, and in the little time that I had off, I think I hiked every mountain on Oahu. When I got back to Orlando, where I'd been for a couple of decades at that point, it felt a little flat, and I felt, I'm ready for something different. And having grown up in Massachusetts, it was not a big leap to come back here. I'd actually done an internship with Fidelity when I was in school as well. When I knew I wanted to do human resources at Disney, I did a recruiting internship at Fidelity to kind of get my feet wet. And there was a role open that was also a PMO type role in the employee space and workplace. And so that was how I made that transition. I didn't really know that workplace strategy was a thing at that time, because Disney is so focused on the front of the house and the guest experience. The built environments for employees are not really the hugest priority. So I took that role at Fidelity, and I said, oh yeah, this is a sweet spot. I want to hang out in workplace for a while.
And that was the first time that you had really experienced that. And how did it feel, or how did you approach workplace compared to other folks that were at Fidelity? I imagine your background coming more from the HR side probably gave you a slightly different lens or spin on the way you thought about that topic, maybe than other folks that had spent their career in real estate and were thinking about workplace maybe from the other angle.
I think that helped. What really grounded me, though, is the whole concept of design thinking, which is fundamentally based on empathy for the human the end user and the human that you're supporting. And that was sort of the buzzy phrase at the time in the workplace world. But I grew up on that. That was how we were raised at Disney. So it was very intuitive to me. And I thought, well, why aren't we doing this? This is, this really makes sense. So I think that was probably my one differentiator, is just the ability to think about design from the user perspective without having to think too hard about it.
Yeah, that cultural installation and values installation from Disney kind of applies nicely to that.
Oh man, in your formative years, it's formative. Like, I still cannot point with one finger. I point with two. I still pick up trash. When you grow up professionally in a place like that, it leaves a mark.
Yeah. And that's culture, by the way, right? Like, the idea that impacted you not just during that time, but for generations afterward, right? In terms of your career it's a pretty big testament.
I guess that's true.
Yeah. So all of that experience, both at Disney and Fidelity, I think was probably a pretty good foundation for what ended up happening at Merck. And so can you talk a little bit about, you joined Merck, I think, next, and when did you join? Where was that relative to the pandemic and a lot of evolution? Would love to hear a little bit more about that experience.
I joined Merck in 2018, so before the pandemic, and I was brought on to lead the workplace and occupancy planning and move management functions. And it was exciting to join an organization that, had such a powerful mission, and doing the work of workplace in that environment was great. We had some meaty projects that were being done. There's a lot of change management. So that was an exciting time. It was really sort of my first official, okay, I'm a workplace person now, and I'm going to do workplace.
And so 2018, you get there, you get your feet under you. Pandemic comes in early 2020. Talk about what that experience was like and kind of like how those initial weeks or months went as Merck tried to transition through some of that.
That was an interesting time for all of us. So when the pandemic hit, like many other people, it was a time of big anxiety for me, just, existentially. And, if you're skewed towards anxiety like I am, it was just sort of a big time. And on top of that, we had this whole idea of, okay, well, we have to get people working from home. What was interesting, though, was, I think there was a perception that we have all this stuff to do to get people equipped to work from home. But people have been making that migration for 15 plus years now. And it's gone with technology. So as technology has enabled people to be more mobile, they've been making decisions about where to do their work. And a lot of times that's at home. So they would come in for meetings and, their busy work they would do at home on a Friday, that type of thing. So it was, I think a lot of companies discovered that during the early days of the pandemic. And then it very quickly became, okay, we got to get ready to bring people back. And it was, I think, that was a constant theme for probably 2 years. First, it was, okay, we're going to come back after 3 weeks of lockdown. Nope, not yet, though. So it's going to be May. It's probably going to be June. Well, people are really at home for the summer. And so it's going to be, and that went on and on and on. And, but I do want to call out, while I was at Merck, one of the lead executives, Julie Gerberding, who used to run the CDC, became the voice of she became our go-to source. That she would do, video meetings and webinars for all of the employees during the pandemic to kind of talk us off the ledge and talk about what was happening. And I just have the highest respect for her. She's an incredibly accomplished woman, and it was exactly what people needed right then, was the science, the policy, here's what you can do. So that was great to have that resource. It was a great place to be.
I hadn't thought about that there's actually, it's unique to be in a company like that during that time where you've got that level of leadership and expertise on a topic that's at least related to what a lot of folks spend a lot of their day job on.
Yes. And it was great to get the facts, and it was incredibly reassuring to have a grown up in the room saying, this is tough, but we got it. We know how to deal with this, and we're going to take it as it comes and get through it.
So the time horizon kept slipping, which wasn't unique to Merck. There's lots and lots of companies experienced that. Merck is particularly interesting because you've got a mix of folks that really have to be on site to do the work that they do. And then some folks that maybe have more flexibility in nature based on the type of work that they do. How did you balance through that, and how did that start to evolve into a thought process on not just what that was going to look like during the pandemic, but maybe what it was going to look like on a more medium-term, long-term basis coming out of it?
First, I would say that even lab scientists are becoming more virtual. So although a lot of that research absolutely has to happen in person, some experiments are set up and they run, and then the scientist comes back sometime later, days, a week. So it's not exactly as I think it has always been in the past. But I guess, having worked at Disney, I've always been pretty sensitive to what I would call the on-site essential worker, or the place-based worker, who physically cannot do their job any place other than a particular environment. So that wasn't a big stretch for me to really be thinking about that group. And, I think understanding that everybody's employee experience is different based on their job, based on their experience and their credentials. And so the idea of equity, there's always that haves and have-nots, and you get to work from home and I don't. So balancing those things was pretty familiar turf for me.
And how did it play out in practice, especially for that group that was more place-based? Was the orientation at Merck and for you more around, let's get the right safety precautions in place so folks can feel at least as comfortable as possible around it? Was there an angle around starting to shift the flexibility posture so people could spend, I don't know, longer days, but only fewer days in kind of like labs? Or I'm curious, what kind of adjustments or transformations did you make to try to account for that?
Yeah, I think in the early days, it was really all about creating a safe environment so that work could continue and the business could be uninterrupted. And it was sort of all hands on deck. Let's figure out how to make this safe for people. And of course, you have research scientists, they know if it's not safe. So, it had to be, correctly done. And so that was really the main focus during those days.
And where did Merck net out longer over that? Post as companies started to come back more into their office, especially for folks that maybe had less place-based work. How did you start to think about policy and what pieces you kept and what pieces you kind of returned to from Merck approach to the workplace prior to the pandemic? I'm just curious how that started to evolve.
Yeah. So most big companies, in my experience, are decentralized in how those types of policies are applied. The business unit leaders are empowered to really decide what's best for their business. And that was not the exception at Merck. It was definitely the case there. So prior to the pandemic, there had already been a lot of support for flexibility. There was a full program, unassigned seating, all the stuff. So it wasn't a huge transition, but I left Merck pretty early in the pandemic, so I couldn't tell you how the story ends. I'm sure it's still continuing today.
Got it. And when you left Merck, and you were the next step, I think, for you was to move to Raytheon. Mm-hmm. It sounds like from some of our past conversations that there was almost like a very similar thought process or kind of like point of view evaluation taking place. I'm just curious, as you got there, where were they in that journey and big picture? What did you find to be similar or different from another large company, but in obviously a different industry?
First, I want to clarify that I'll talk about my experiences with Merck, but any commentary or opinion is just mine. Or RTX either. I should say that for all my employers. But for RTX in particular, I'm not speaking on behalf of the organization. So, but what was interesting was it was almost the exact same job because the work for all big employers was so much the same at that point in the workplace world. I almost feel like I didn't miss a beat, except my email address had changed. All that and having to learn a whole new huge company, but the same issues with, when do we bring people back and how do we create the right environment and what's our policy going to be? Are we going to be hybrid or, exactly the same? And, what's interesting about that is that as I've gone through different employers in this workplace space and learned more about, the drivers of behavior and what makes a good workplace, there are way more similarities among employers than there are differences. So even though the brands are distinct and the industry is very different, people are people, and the fundamental needs of people are pretty universal. Obviously every job's a little different and it has different requirements, but especially in knowledge work, it's a lot of the same. So that was a huge learning to me because I think there's a temptation to sort of otherize yourself or otherize groups. Well, we're special because we're, named the function. And the reality is they're not. What's different is leaders have different expectations and different preferences, but fundamentally humans need the same things. And humans, as in terms of demographics, are not all that different from each other either. Like generations is my favorite thing to pick on because it's, always gets a lot of press, but generational theory is kind of nonsense from a research standpoint. And when you really get into it, you realize that there's more variability within one person's experience than between people or among people, and what differentiates my needs is life stage. That's what dictates what's important to me at the time. It's not whether I'm in accounting or, treasury, it's life stage. And so, that's been, I think, one of my big takeaways, as I've crossed from one organization to another.
And so, and by the way, that deeply resonates with me because I've seen it. I think I told you I have a 2.5-year-old and a 6-month-old. And so I've seen that even evolve for us as a family over the last 3 or 4 years on the front end of having a child when like baby was really young, moving into toddler, having a second child, and my needs and where I wanted to spend time or where my wife wanted to spend time evolved quite a bit, even relative to what feels like a really short time period in the course of a career.
You're in it right now, aren't you, with the kids? Yeah.
Deep in it.
Those early days are tough, but it doesn't get easier, it just gets different. So they get older and there's activities to schlep them to. And you have to think about what do they do on school break? And what if they get sick and you're worried about them because they're on their phone and who are they talking to? Yeah. So it doesn't get easier to be a good parent who's also employed full-time in a job. But yeah, those are pretty common needs. I think there are things that distinguish needs based on socioeconomics, of course. But the other big one is commute. How far do you live? Which also has to do with economics. If you're not in the right zip code, then your life is going to be a lot harder and your needs are going to be different. And I think this is one of the reasons that we find that for example, preference for flexibility, it's super important for every demographic. But as you get to more and more marginalized groups, it becomes more and more important because their lives are a little bit tougher. So that flexibility is what enables them to manage everything. And I'm not saying you're marginalized, but as a parent, it's top priority for you, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I think the U.S. data on this, women aged 25, 54 participating in the workforce at all-time highs. People with disabilities participating in the workforce all-time highs. I don't think that's an accident with relation to flexibility and the idea that people maybe not have to be in the office every day.
Absolutely.
And what does that mean from an access perspective to economic opportunity?
I think that's absolutely true. I had done a focus group some time back, and one of the participants, this was with an ERG, and we were talking about, why flexibility is important. And he said, when I'm on Zoom, you don't notice my wheelchair. You just notice me. And that's been really powerful for people. And, there's all kinds of great testimonials. I'm not really saying anything that hasn't been said before, probably by me. I tend to repeat myself. But it's been hugely impactful, but it's been really tough on leaders, I think, because it's just rocked their world and it's such a different way of operating. And so I think that's, there's been benefits and there's been puts and takes on both sides.
So you've talked a little bit about a philosophy around this, which is remembering that your employees are human beings and thinking about the whole human. And that's obviously deeply ingrained in you from experiences that you've had in lots of different organizations and in your training. You talked about how Merck and RTX are not so dissimilar in that way. And so for leaders who are struggling on this topic, and you've mentioned that it's hard and they're at bigger companies, is there a particular thought process or a way of approaching the topic that you found to be successful, or you would suggest that they go through in terms of how do we get to the right answer for our organization and balance standardization with customization based on what people need? Curious how you talk to others or help others think through this type of topic.
Right. And oftentimes it's left to the leader. You do what works for you. We have a policy, but so I don't think there's any silver bullet. There's no easy button. It's hard work, and leaders have to learn how to choreograph, which, if you could take presence for granted, you didn't have to worry about people running into each other, but now you have to create the moments, So I think though, that if you were going to focus on one thing, I would say, forget about the where and when, if you can. If it's not germane to the job, let your employees figure that out along with the how. Your job is to tell them the what and the why. So if you can focus on the deliverables and what needs to get done and how and the quality of that work, and then and you allow your employee to figure out the why, you're going to get to the right place. And you'll have a much better way of measuring the outcomes. That's the other favorite thing. But I think we get hyper focused on the logistics of it, and it gets too far away from why we're actually doing the work in the first place. So, if all else fails, treat them like a vendor. write a statement of work, like with vendors, we have very explicit agreements. Sometimes we negotiate for weeks and months to get to them, but we have very explicit agreements about what work is going to get done by when, the milestones. And I think that's a helpful approach for any type of work. And so that will free up your conversation with employees. So it's not a battle of wills. It's about, okay, what's the best way to get this done? What are your other responsibilities that, that I need you to pay attention to? So one of those that I think deserves a little more attention is teaching and learning. I hear a lot, well, we need people to be physically together because that's how they learn. You get tacit knowledge from your colleagues, et cetera. And so that can't happen if the smart person, or the knowledgeable person, I should say, is not physically there. So we have to make sure they come in. And I think, well, yes, but do they know that teaching is part of their job? Maybe it was taken for granted before, but it hasn't been made explicit. So if you make it explicit, hey, 20% of your job, Adrienne, is going to be getting Rob up to speed. Figure out how to do that. Okay, well, you know what? I'm probably going to want to meet in person periodically, maybe more than that. And if we're working on, detailed spreadsheets and things, I might want to have you over my shoulder, so I'm going to figure that out. I don't need to be told that, doing some stuff in person is a good idea. So that's where I net out on those things. It's just hard for folks, though, because this is, especially the more senior you are, the more time you've had working wildly successfully in a very specific way that's different from how people are telling you they want to work today. So I don't want to discount the difficulty of that. And it's a variable that, in the wake of a lot of other huge business issues, you just want to make stand still. Can I just stop this bus so I can focus on this other stuff? I think it's, I don't want to discount how hard that is. And we're all learning. It's going to take a while.
Have you found that managers on average have been able, with the organizations that you've been part of, to kind of adapt to that line of thinking and focus more on that? Or is there a training gap or a skill gap that you've had to close, or how have you kind of like approached getting them to wrap their head around thinking about that differently?
I think it's like anything else. Some folks are more open to new ideas and ways of doing things, and others are more reliant on what they know works or what's worked in the past. So I think it runs the gamut. Certainly there are some bright stars out there who, are exceptionally good at charting out deliverables, frankly, and then they can really focus on that and not be so hyper-focused on the logistics of it. I also think that there are some who have there is a talent for knowing when you need to bring people together, how often do you need to meet face-to-face to establish trust and maintain trust, and working that balance. So some folks might have a little bit of an advantage just, naturally in that, but it's something we're all going to have to learn, and it's going to have to settle out.
I want to go back to a topic that we talked about a little bit earlier in the conversation, because a lot of the discussion we were having around being less focused on place and time is obviously more relevant to office-based workers. And if you are place-based, then that obviously changes the degrees of freedom quite a bit. How have you started to think about what that frontier looks like? And are we going to be in this office conversation still for a while? Or do you think that's kind of like where we're headed on some of these points of the discussion?
I don't think I can do one more. So I think that, first of all, being upfront about what the deliverables are. What is a requirement? Okay. Adrienne, you're a nurse. I'm not a nurse. Let's say I was. Nursing requires this. You have to be physically there to, deliver the meds. But maybe you can be flexible with time. Maybe there's more flexibility in terms of when I start my shift, or how many shifts I do a week, or, I think there are other ways to offer that flexibility, because what you're trying to do is to give people some sense of agency about their work and enable them to manage their lives. And, let's be honest, a lot of people have redesigned their lives in the past few years, and it's not so easy. I had a colleague who's from France, and he made the excellent point that, it's going to be harder for people in the US to go back to work because we don't have the social infrastructure that you have in other countries, particularly in the EU, where, childcare is all set. Here, like once, and you probably know this, once you get a good solution, like, oh my gosh, you just do not want anything to disrupt that, and the thought of it.
I'm in New York City, and so I feel that even more acutely in terms of like trying to get that constellation of things right.
It is hard. It is hard work. So, I think that's something we have to really keep in mind, that what flexibility can you offer, I think is a good way to approach it.
I like the thought process around flexibility linked to agency. Why is agency so important from your experience around this topic? Like, why is this? Why should we think about these concepts as linked and therefore so important for employees of all types?
I think it's fundamental to being human, and particularly in a place like the U.S. where we have such an independent streak. We want to each do things our own way. I mean, we should expect that people are going to want to, have the ability to customize their work experience. It's how we are. And I think everybody's wired that way. We all want to have that measure of influence of our surroundings. I'm certainly no exception, as much as I wish I was a super elevated, stoic, can deal with any situation person. I like certain temperature levels and sound levels, and it feels good to be able to influence those things.
I want to go full circle because I think it's interesting the way you talk about the future of flexibility, and not just for office, but also for more place-based work.
Yeah.
And, in some ways, I think this experience comes all the way back to your time at Disney. And I think you thought about this even in kind of like union work around flexibility. And so I would just love to talk about that for a second, and kind of like how even some of those early moments and discussions kind of like grounded some of your thought process around this.
Yeah. And I don't want to overstep because, again, I'm not part of that organization anymore. And so this is based on what was happening then. But this is one of the reasons it was so important to have childcare centers that were open 365, 17 hours a day, with backup care that at the time was between $5 and $15 a day per employee per child. And the reason is that for hourly roles that are under the union agreement, which is pretty much all of them, scheduling is done by seniority. So, which may or may not, and probably doesn't, align with your need for flexibility. So you'd have folks who were new to the organization just at the mercy of whatever was left on the schedule. And Disney's open every day. So, you probably are working nights and weekends and during pickup time, and it might change the next week. And so that's, super stressful for people. So on the other side, we were, okay, well, what can we do to make that easier? So I don't know the answer. I'm not an expert in union environments, to be sure, but I do know that seniority-based scheduling seems like a mismatch with what people's needs are.
So it sounds like there may need to be some fundamental rethinks around even how some of that gets designed in different types of environments, if it's possible and people are open to it, to try and create a better sum of all parts, if you will, for the entire group.
I think it's a pretty entrenched idea. So that would take a lot, but I don't think it's a bad line of inquiry. I think it would be worth pursuing.
So maybe a couple final thoughts. We talked a bit about office, and I think you and I are both probably similarly tired of the conversation around where and some of those pieces. Where do you hope the conversation evolves to? Like, if you're looking 6 months, 12 months, we were to have this conversation in spring of 2025. Like, what do you hope we're talking about when it comes to flexibility and the frontier of work in that way?
I'm a realist, so I have high hopes, of course, but where I would like to think we are is at a place of acceptance where the data would say that, and this is national data, all over, it would say that we reached a steady state probably about 14 months ago. Beginning of 2023 was we still see the seasonal variability, and economy goes down, people get scared, they come into the office, that kind of thing. But I think in terms of, work patterns, that was the point. So my hope would be that we all have come to terms with that and are moving forward with that knowledge.
I think that's right. And in some way, if 2023 was a year of continuing to push on, is it going to be a return to office? Are we going to have people come back full time? Maybe this year or in the future are more around, okay, this is the world. Let's think about how we enable it and do best by our employees and get the most out of these types of operations.
Well, and there are powerful forces, powerful interests for people coming into the office, and they're understandable. The cities depend on it. Their revenue depends on offices being full. Thousands of small businesses, public transit. I think that the big winners of the pandemic were dogs, and the big losers were the rats in cities. But it's going to fundamentally change cities, and that's I think a big important issue that no one person or group is going to solve, but that we'll have to grapple with, and I hope we do.
Yeah, I think that's right. Everything from tax base to what does the retail pattern look like to pricing of commercial real estate and the taxes associated with that. I think there's a number of things that'll take years, if not decades, potentially in some locations to
absolutely. And we're probably going to have some cities that go into decay. I would not be surprised. So cities are going to really have to be on their game to figure out, how do we deal with the falling revenue. I just saw an article that I think Boston School District just approved a cut in funding for next year, I'm sure based on these conditions. It's going to be hard.
Absolutely. And especially in the ones where in Boston is this way, parts of New York City are this way, San Francisco is this way, where there's real central business district that was very office heavy,
But these are also places where commutes are painful. And having done the slog into Boston every day for 5 years, it's 90 minutes door to door from where I live. And granted, I live in a place that's super inconvenient, but a lot of people have that experience. And so that is like the number one barrier to people being present more, is how painful is the commute. You can understand that. So those cities have a double challenge.
Yeah. And interestingly enough, I'll share one data point of the research we were doing recently. We did some analysis on the percentage of firms by metro in the US that offered work location flexibility. So if that company had an office there and they were hybrid, then we would count it as hybrid, as like a point into that city, if you will, to get a sense of what the firm base locally looked like. And as a result, is one city or metro more flexible, so to speak, in terms of the way they approach it. And the two biggest correlates with the percentage of firms that offered flexibility in that area was one, commute, and the percentage of people who had 60-minute plus commutes in that particular location. And the other was cost of living. And as a result, you think about like how expensive it is to come in or to buy food or whatever it is in that particular location. So I think that's very true, and it hits certain cities disproportionately.
Absolutely. And, it goes back to, this is probably the outcome we should expect, because we live in a society in the US where all of that is the worker's responsibility to figure out. So they're going to figure out what's optimal for them. And it might not be the place that you established for them to do their work.
Any final thoughts, things that we didn't talk about that are burning or top of mind for you?
I think that, employers, and definitely the one I'm with now, really are working hard to figure out, how do we balance all of this? How do we establish the right expectations and meet people's needs? And it is tough work. I think that we've got lots of great leaders who are up to the challenge. And I'm looking forward to seeing how this all pans out.
Me too. One final question for you. If for listeners who really enjoyed learning more about you and hearing what you had to say, is there anywhere you would send them to get more information on what you're thinking about or writing about or anything like that?
They can certainly find me on LinkedIn. I go to conferences now and again, and I'm always happy. I can talk all day about this stuff. So. Always happy for a conversation.
Well, look, I really enjoyed this discussion, and I think your experience is really tailored in some ways to this moment. And it seems like a lot of companies are having to think about their employees more as guests, if you will, and what it means to solve for this for them, whether they be office-based or more place or office work rather, or more place-based in nature. So thank you for sharing all of those pearls of wisdom and insights from your experience. I really enjoyed the discussion.
Well, I'm so glad to have been here, and thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, you can subscribe on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Please also consider giving us a rating or leaving a review, as that helps other listeners find the podcast. For more Flex Index content, including past episodes, our Flex Index newsletter, and monthly research reports, visit flex.scoopforwork.com. See you next time.